Echoes of the past, a new beginning for a fractured family. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. For 10 years, I thought my family hated me, until a manila envelope proved they were just lied to. My name is Clara. I'm 30 years old now, and for the last decade of my life, I have been a ghost. I run a quiet, modest pottery studio 3 states away from the sprawling, suffocating estate where I grew up. I like the quiet. I like the clay. It doesn't lie to you, and it certainly doesn't frame you for a felony. 10 years ago, my family banished me. They erased me from photographs, changed the locks on the doors, and told all the extended relatives that I had simply gone off the deep end. The official story, the one my parents repeated until it became gospel, was that I embezzled $50,000 from my father's business account to fund a phantom addiction. But that was a massive, life-ruining lie. And sitting right here on my scratched kitchen counter was the undeniable proof. It arrived yesterday in a plain, unmarked manila envelope. No return address, no note explaining who sent it, just a faded postmark from my hometown. Inside was a thick stack of yellowing paper. I pulled out the first page, my hands trembling. It was a high-quality photocopy of a bank ledger from 10 years ago, dated exactly 3 days before the family money vanished. Attached to the ledger was a handwritten promissory note from an illegal, high-stakes poker room operating out of a basement lounge. The name printed at the top of the crushing debt? Julian, my older brother, the golden child. Julian was the heir apparent, the one who had stood in the corner of my father's heavy mahogany study with fake tears in his eyes as my mother screamed at me to get out of her house. Why now? Who sent this evidence after a decade of silence? The questions buzzed in my head like a swarm of angry bees. I flipped to the next page, smelling the faint, metallic scent of old ink on the photocopies. It was a forged authorization form. The handwriting was a clumsy, rushed attempt at my signature, but the pen pressure was heavily indented, exactly the way Julian writes when he's stressed. He had drained the business accounts to pay off his massive gambling debts. When the internal auditors came knocking, he panicked and pointed the finger straight at his messy, rebellious younger sister. The final piece of paper in the envelope changed my entire plan for the future. The memory of the day I was exiled is burned into my brain like a physical brand. I was just 20 years old, wearing paint-splattered jeans and exhausted from finals week, when I was summoned to my father's home office. The air in the room was thick and suffocating. My mother, Helen, stood by the heavy oak desk, her face twisted in a mixture of rage and absolute disgust. Spread out across the polished wood were bank statements highlighting the missing $50,000. Before I could even ask what was going on, the accusations started flying like shrapnel. My mother screamed that I was a thief, a degenerate who was dragging our pristine family name through the mud. "We know about your habits, Clara," she yelled, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. I was completely bewildered. I begged them to check the security cameras at the bank, to review the computer logs, to literally call the police and investigate it properly. Why would I steal from my own family? I sobbed, dropping to my knees. But they wouldn't listen. They said my drug problem, a vicious, fabricated rumor that I now realized Julian had been carefully planting in their ears for months, was all the proof they needed. I looked around the room, desperate for a lifeline. My father refused to even look at me, staring out the window with his jaw clenched tightly. And then there was Julian, my charming, perfect older brother. He was leaning against the bookshelves, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt, looking down at me with an expression of profound, heartbreaking disappointment. "Just tell them the truth, Clara," he said softly, playing the role of the sympathetic sibling to absolute perfection. "We can get you the help you need if you just confess." The sheer audacity of his performance still makes me nauseous today. He was the one who forged my name. He was the one who gambled away the money. Yet he stood there, completely spotless in the eyes of my parents, letting me take the entire fall for his catastrophic mistakes. I lost my family, my home, and every single cent of my inheritance in the span of 30 agonizing minutes. Julian just stood in the corner and watched them tear my entire life to shreds. For 10 years, I survived on my own. I worked brutal double shifts as a waitress, slept on lumpy air mattresses, and slowly, painstakingly built my pottery business from the ground up. I learned to live without a safety net, without the comforting delusion that my family would ever be there to catch me if I fell. I had accepted my permanent role as the exiled black sheep. But just 2 days after the anonymous manila envelope arrived, shattering my hard-won peace, the mail carrier dropped off something else. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope made of heavy, expensive cardstock. The familiar embossed crest of my family's estate was pressed onto the flap. Inside was a formal invitation to my parents' 40th wedding anniversary gala. It was going to be a massive, high-stakes gathering with over 100 guests, politicians, and business partners. The invitation was addressed to me, written in my mother's stiff, elegant calligraphy. A tiny, passive-aggressive sticky note was attached to the back. "We expect you to make an appearance, Clara. Do not embarrass us." A week ago, I would have thrown the invitation directly into the garbage disposal and turned on the blades. Going back to that house meant stepping back into a psychological war zone where I was completely unarmed. But things were different now. I walked over to the kitchen counter and looked down at the stack of undeniable, heavily documented proof. The bank ledger, the forged signature, the illegal gambling debts. I wasn't the helpless, bewildered 20-year-old girl they threw out into the cold anymore. I was an independent woman armed with the devastating truth. If they wanted me to make an appearance, I would give them a night they would never, ever forget. I wouldn't just attend the gala. I was going to use their precious, image-obsessed gathering as the ultimate stage to finally clear my name. I packed my best dress, carefully secured the copies of the evidence in a waterproof folder, and booked a one-way flight back to my hometown. I checked the box marked attending and dropped the heavy envelope into the corner mailbox. Stepping through the massive double doors of my childhood home felt like walking straight into a mausoleum. The sprawling estate was exactly as I remembered it, coldly immaculate, reeking of expensive floral arrangements, and utterly devoid of genuine warmth. Caterers buzzed around the foyer, balancing trays of champagne, while a string quartet tuned their instruments in the grand living room. As I walked down the grand hallway, the ambient chatter among the early arriving family members suddenly died. The icy stares hit me like physical blows. Extended aunts and uncles who hadn't spoken to me in a decade openly glared, pulling their designer coats tighter around their shoulders as if my mere presence might infect them. I heard the hushed, vicious whispers echoing off the marble floors. "I can't believe she actually showed her face," one aunt muttered to another. "Helen is far too forgiving," someone else scoffed. I kept my spine completely rigid, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. My heart was hammering fiercely against my ribs, but I forced my face into a mask of total indifference. I was looking for one person. "Clara," a soft, hesitant voice called out from the doorway of the library. I turned and felt the first genuine wave of relief wash over me in 10 years. It was Cousin Maya. We used to be inseparable as kids, but my sudden banishment had violently severed our bond. Unlike the rest of the sharks in this house, Maya's eyes weren't filled with judgment or malice. They were brimming with unshed tears. She hurried across the hallway, ignoring the scandalous gasps of our relatives, and grabbed my hands. She looked me up and down, taking in the confident, scarred woman I had become. We hadn't spoken properly since the day I was thrown out, but the connection was still incredibly strong. Without caring who was watching us from the parlor, Maya pulled me into a tight hug and whispered that she knew I was innocent. The warmth of Maya's embrace was abruptly shattered by the sound of slow, mocking applause echoing from the top of the grand staircase. I looked up, and my stomach instantly twisted into a tight, sick knot. There he was, Julian, the golden child. He slowly descended the stairs, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than my entire pottery kiln. He looked exactly the same as he did a decade ago, effortlessly handsome, dripping with arrogant charisma, and entirely convinced of his own untouchable superiority. He was now poised to officially inherit the family legacy during this very anniversary weekend. He glided across the foyer, waving away the caterers, and stopped right in front of me. Well, look what the cat dragged in." Julian smirked, his voice dripping with condescension. "I genuinely didn't think you had the nerve to show up, Clara." He leaned in close, so only Maya and I could hear his next words. The fake charm instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, reptilian glare. "Let's get one thing incredibly straight," he hissed, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. Mom invited you because it looks good for the family image. A display of Christian charity for the prodigal disaster. But you're going to stay quietly in the corner, you are not going to drink, and you are absolutely not going to ruin this weekend for me. The sheer, blinding hypocrisy of his words burned through my veins like battery acid. This man had literally destroyed my life to cover up his own filthy, illegal mistakes, and now he was lecturing me about ruining things. I looked at his perfectly styled hair, his expensive watch, and the arrogant tilt of his chin. My fingers twitched, desperately wanting to reach into my bag and slap the photocopied bank ledger right across his smug face. But I needed to be smart. I needed the audience. So, I just smiled pleasantly. He smiled his perfect smile, completely unaware that I had the power to destroy him. Later that evening, the family gathered in the sunroom for pre-dinner cocktails. The tension in the air was so thick you could carve it with a steak knife. I sat quietly on a velvet sofa, sipping sparkling water, while Julian held court by the fireplace. He was loudly recounting a story about his recent brilliant investments, soaking up the adoring praise of our aunts and uncles. My mother, Helen, stood beside him, beaming with aggressive pride, while steadfastly refusing to even look in my direction. It was the perfect moment to drop a small, highly calibrated bomb. During a brief lull in Julian's arrogant monologue, I leaned forward and set my glass down on the glass coffee table with a loud, deliberate clink. "You know, Julian," I said, keeping my voice light and conversational. "Speaking of investments, I recently watched a fascinating documentary about underground poker rings. Did you know there used to be a huge, illegal high-stakes game running right out of the basement of the old Velvet Lounge downtown?" The entire room went dead silent. The Velvet Lounge was the exact location listed on the promissory note I had received in the anonymous package. It had been closed for years. I watched Julian's face intently. For a fraction of a second, the charismatic, golden boy mask slipped entirely. His eyes widened in sheer, naked panic, and the champagne glass in his hand trembled so violently that a few drops spilled onto his pristine tuxedo pants. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I have no idea what you're talking about," he stammered, his voice suddenly sounding reedy and thin. "Why would I know about that?" My mother frowned, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, and quickly tried to change the subject. But the damage was already done. The seed of terror had been planted in my brother's mind. His face went completely white as the terrifying reality of my words finally hit him. Julian's panicked reaction was all the confirmation I needed, but I wanted absolute, undeniable leverage. The anonymous package was a fantastic start, but my family was notoriously stubborn. If I presented photocopies, Julian would simply claim they were elaborate fakes I had fabricated out of spite. I needed something physical from inside the house to permanently corroborate the anonymous claims. After the awkward cocktail hour mercifully ended and the guests dispersed to dress for the main gala, I slipped away from the bustling crowd. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crept down the dimly lit back hallway toward my father's old home office. The door was locked, but I still knew where my mother hid the spare brass key, inside the hollowed-out base of the antique globe in the library. I retrieved the key, unlocked the heavy oak door, and slipped inside, turning on a single desk lamp. The room smelled exactly the same: leather, lemon polish, and old paper. The anonymous ledger in my possession was from the family business's secondary holding account. If my father was as meticulous as I remembered, he would have kept the original, physical copies of all 10-year-old financial disputes in his private safe. I knew the combination to the floor safe by heart. It was my mother's birthday. I spun the dial, praying they hadn't changed it after my banishment. With a heavy click, the metal door swung open. I dug through stacks of old property deeds and life insurance policies until my fingers brushed against a thick, dusty manila folder labeled 2016 Audit. My breath hitched. I pulled the folder out and frantically flipped through the crisp, aged pages. I cross-referenced the dates with the notes I had memorized from the anonymous package. And there it was. Tucked inside the leather binding was the original bank statement with my brother's forged signature. Holding the original, decade-old bank statement in my trembling hands, I felt a rush of absolute vindication. The blue ink of the forged signature was slightly smeared, a detail the photocopy couldn't capture perfectly, but the heavy, aggressive pen strokes were undeniably Julian's handwriting. I had the smoking gun, but as I moved to slide the document into my jacket pocket, another piece of paper fluttered out of the folder and landed softly on the Persian rug. It was a letter written on my mother's personal monogrammed stationery, dated just 1 week after I had been violently kicked out of the house. I crouched down and picked it up. As I read the elegant, sweeping handwriting, the air was suddenly sucked out of my lungs. It was an unsent letter addressed to her sister, my Aunt Catherine. "I fear I have made a terrible mistake," the letter began. "The bank manager discreetly called me today regarding the missing funds. He mentioned that Julian had been seen visiting the branch multiple times the week the money vanished, looking highly agitated. I confronted Julian, and he became incredibly defensive, almost hysterical. I suspect he took the money, Catherine. But the scandal would absolutely ruin his future in politics, and it would break his father's fragile heart. Clara is already so fiercely independent, she can survive on her own. I had to protect the family legacy." A wave of profound, suffocating nausea washed over me. I had to grip the edge of the mahogany desk just to stay upright. All these years, I thought my mother had simply been tricked by Julian's sociopathic lies. I thought she was just a victim of his masterful manipulation. But this letter proved a much darker, much more devastating reality. She had figured it out almost immediately. She knew Julian was the real thief. My own mother knew the truth and still chose to throw me to the wolves. I stumbled out of the dark office, my chest tightening with a betrayal so deep it felt like a physical wound. The anger I had harbored toward Julian was now entirely eclipsed by the agonizing reality of my mother's calculated sacrifice. I retreated to the guest bathroom, splashing cold water on my face until the redness faded from my eyes. I couldn't afford to break down now. I pulled out my phone and texted Maya to meet me in my assigned guest bedroom immediately. When she slipped through the door a few minutes later, locking it securely behind her, I didn't say a single word. I just handed her the anonymous copies, the original bank statement, and my mother's unsent letter. Maya sat on the edge of the bed, reading through the documents in complete silence. When she finally looked up, tears were streaming down her face. "Oh, Clara," she whispered, her voice cracking with fury and heartbreak. "I always knew you didn't do it, but this is purely evil. Julian destroyed you, and Aunt Helen just let him do it." I wiped my own tears away, my resolve hardening into solid steel. "I'm not leaving this house until every single person downstairs knows exactly who they are applauding tonight," I told her. Maya nodded fiercely, instantly shifting from sympathetic cousin to a strategic ally. We spent the next hour formulating a flawless plan. The main anniversary dinner was scheduled to begin at 8 o'clock in the grand dining hall. My mother had arranged for Julian to give the opening toast, cementing his position as the flawless heir. That was my window. Maya sneaked down to the estate's sprawling home office and used the commercial printer to make 20 high-quality copies of the entire evidence packet. We arranged the copied documents into neat little piles for every single guest at dinner. With the evidence securely hidden in my oversized evening clutch, I made my way down the grand staircase toward the dining hall. The house was alive with the sound of clinking crystal and polite laughter. But before I could reach the safety of the crowded room, a heavy hand grabbed my arm and roughly yanked me into the darkened butler's pantry. I stumbled forward, the door clicking shut behind me. Julian stood there, blocking the exit. The charming, golden boy facade was completely gone, replaced by the cornered, desperate look of a trapped animal. He was sweating through his expensive tuxedo shirt. "What exactly did you mean earlier, Clara?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "About the velvet lounge. What do you know?" I straightened my posture, refusing to let him see even an ounce of fear. "I know everything, Julian," I said plainly, staring directly into his panicked eyes. "I have the ledger. I have the promissory note from the poker room. And I have the original bank statement with your incredibly sloppy forgery." For a second, I thought he might actually hit me. His fists clenched, and his face turned a mottled, furious red. But then, surprisingly, the anger completely drained out of him, leaving behind a pathetic, hollow shell. He ran a shaking hand through his perfectly styled hair and pulled a small leather checkbook from his inner jacket pocket. "Look, Clara, let's be reasonable adults about this," he pleaded. his voice cracking with desperation. You've always struggled financially, right? That little pottery shop can't be making much. I can write you a check right now. $200,000. Enough to buy a house in cash. Just take the money, walk out the back door, and never speak of this again. He shoved the checkbook toward me with desperate eyes that begged me to stay quiet. I looked down at the expensive leather checkbook hovering in the space between us. $200,000. For a brief, fleeting second, my exhausted mind calculated how many kills that could buy, how many months of rent it could instantly cover. But then I looked at my brother's face. I saw the 10 years of agonizing loneliness, the missed holidays, the relentless whispering, and the total destruction of my reputation. No amount of money in the world could ever buy back the decade he had stolen from me. I knocked his hand away, the checkbook falling to the floor. Keep your dirty money, Julian, I whispered coldly. I'm going to dinner. I pushed past him, leaving him trembling in the dark pantry, and walked straight into the brilliantly lit dining hall. The long table was exquisitely decorated with towering floral centerpieces and glittering silver. I took my assigned seat near the far end, quietly catching Maya's eye across the room. She gave me a tiny, encouraging nod. Moments later, Julian slid into his seat at the head of the table, his face ashen, looking like he was walking to the gallows. My mother clinked her crystal glass with a silver spoon, demanding the room's attention. Family and friends, she began, beaming brightly. Tonight, Julian will say a few words to honor our legacy. Julian slowly stood up, his hands gripping the edges of the table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He opened his mouth to speak, but before a single word could escape his lying lips, I pushed my chair back and stood up. The harsh scraping sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. Actually, I announced, my voice ringing out clear and unervingly steady. I have something much more important to share regarding our family's legacy. I passed the first manila envelope down the long table and waited for the explosion. Confusion rippled down the long dining table as the guests slowly opened the crisp manila envelopes. The elegant string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. I watched carefully as my aunts, uncles, and family friends pulled out the thick stacks of paper. First came the confusion, a collective furrowing of brows as they stared at the old bank ledger. Then came the shocked, muffled gasps as they read the attached promissory note from the illegal poker room. Finally, the realization set in as they analyzed the blatantly forged signature on the authorization form. What is the meaning of this absolute nonsense? My uncle sputtered, adjusting his reading glasses as he scrutinized the gambling debts. Julian, these documents say you owed $50,000 to a criminal syndicate. All eyes suddenly snapped to the head of the table. Julian's face was completely drained of color. He looked like a cornered rat. It's a lie, he shouted, his voice cracking violently in the dead-silent room. Clara is unhinged. She faked all of this because she's jealous of my success. Look at the handwriting. It's obviously forged to frame me. He was flailing, desperately trying to rely on the old, familiar tactic of painting me as the crazy, resentful sister. But it wasn't working anymore. The evidence was far too precise, too brutally undeniable. Maya stood up from her chair, holding up her own copy of the packet. It's not a fake, Julian, she said firmly, her voice echoing with disgust. We found the original documents securely locked inside your father's own office safe today. You drained the accounts to save your own skin, and you let Clara take the blame for 10 agonizing years. The deafening silence in the dining room was shattered by my mother's sudden, agonizing sob. The sound of my mother weeping was the spark that ignited the entire powder keg. The dining hall descended into absolute, unprecedented chaos. Relatives started shouting over one another, demanding answers and aggressively waving the forged documents in the air. Julian's carefully constructed empire of lies was burning to the ground in real time. My mother slumped heavily into her chair, covering her perfectly made-up face with trembling hands. Helen, tell them this is a ridiculous prank, Julian pleaded, grabbing her shoulder. But she simply couldn't protect him anymore. I'm sorry, Helen choked out between ragged sobs, refusing to look at me. I found out a week after Clara left. The bank manager told me. But Julian was about to graduate. He had that prestigious internship lined up. I couldn't let his life be ruined over one terrible mistake. I thought Clara was strong enough to handle being away. The collective gasp from the family was incredibly loud. My mother had just confessed to actively covering up a felony to preserve a shallow, fragile illusion of perfection. The sheer weight of her betrayal sucked all the oxygen straight out of the massive room. Realizing that his own mother had just hammered the final nail into his coffin, Julian completely lost his mind. The charming facade instantly dissolved into pure, venomous rage. He aggressively swept his arm across the table, sending crystal wine glasses and expensive china crashing violently onto the hardwood floor. "You arrogant, ungrateful little witch," he screamed at me, his face twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable snarl. "I am the one who built this company up. I deserve that money. You were always nothing but a pathetic loser." Julian screamed that I was ruining the family, but the damage was already permanently done. I stood incredibly still amidst the wreckage of shattered crystal, spilled wine, and screaming relatives. Julian was actively being restrained by two of my uncles as he continued to hurl vicious, venomous insults in my direction, completely unraveling before our very eyes. The elegant, high society anniversary gala had devolved into a pathetic, deeply traumatic brawl. Through the absolute madness of the dining hall, my mother slowly pushed her chair back and stumbled toward me. Her expensive mascara was running down her pale cheeks in dark, messy streaks. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands, trying to grab my wrists. "Clara, please wait," Helen begged, her voice thick with panic and long overdue guilt. I was so wrong. I was terrified of the scandal, and I made a horrific, unforgivable choice. But the truth is finally out now. Julian will go to rehab. He'll step down from the company immediately, and we can fix this together. You can come back home. We can be a real family again. She looked at me with such pathetic, hollow hope, genuinely believing that after 10 years of psychological torture and forced isolation, a simple, tearful apology would suddenly wipe the slate clean. She thought I was still that desperate, terrified 20-year-old girl begging for her mother's approval and love. But as I looked at her tear-stained face, I realized something incredibly liberating. I felt absolutely nothing. No burning anger, no crushing sadness, just a profound, overwhelming sense of finality. I gently but firmly pried her desperate hands off my wrists and took a deliberate step backward, creating a permanent physical boundary. "I don't want your money, and I don't want your house," I said, my voice completely calm and devoid of emotion. "You didn't just break my trust, Mom. You completely broke our family. I'm not here to fix your mess. I just came to clear my name." I looked at the broken people crying around the table and finally said my goodbyes. Walking out of the massive front doors of my childhood home, I took a deep, shuddering breath of the crisp night air. For the first time in an entire decade, my shoulders didn't ache with the crushing, invisible weight of a crime I didn't commit. Behind me, the muffled sounds of shouting and crying still echoed from the grand dining room. But those problems didn't belong to me anymore. Julian would have to face the legal and social consequences of his fraud, and my mother would have to live with the agonizing reality that her obsession with image had cost her both of her children. I walked down the long, winding driveway without looking back once. Maya caught up with me right before I reached the main gates. She didn't try to convince me to stay or guilt me into forgiving them. Instead, she just linked her arm firmly through mine, matching my stride. We walked to my rental car in a comfortable, healing silence. I realized then that family isn't determined by blood or shared bank accounts. It's determined by the people who stand fiercely by your side when the absolute worst happens. Maya was my family. The friends who helped me build my tiny, messy pottery studio were my family. I didn't need the grand estate or the toxic inheritance. It took years of intensive therapy and countless sleepless nights to realize that my worth wasn't tied to my parents' conditional approval. If you are out there carrying the agonizing burden of a family secret or taking the blame to keep a toxic peace, please understand this. The truth is the only weapon that can ever truly protect you. Do not let manipulative people write your story. Walking away from my blood relatives was the most painful thing I have ever endured, but it was also the ultimate act of self-love. The truth broke my family apart, but it gave me back my beautifully imperfect life.